Okay, and we have a new recorded starting, and we'll start talking about Wright's buildings. So let me do a quick poll. We'll start with his home and studio in Oak Park, which he starts in 1889, but it's his laboratory, and he is constantly changing, adding on, experimenting here with it up through when he leaves Oak Park in 1909. And if I can. Okay. I'm going to type in a poll question. So I just posted up a poll question if you've been to the home and studio or not. See how many. So far we're having, everybody says they have been. Great. Anyone haven't been? Good. I mean, it's an incredible resource right here in Oak Park to see. So I'm glad you all have had a chance to go there. And this is not a Prairie style house, actually. And if you took the tour and were paying attention, or you remember, they probably emphasized the fact that this is actually not a Prairie style house. You can see it's a steep pitched roof, for one thing. It's not the low pitched, wide overhanging hipped roof that he would come up with. This is really more Victorian because he starts designing this in 1889, and this is before he had developed the Prairie School about 1900. And it's actually influenced heavily by the first architect he worked for, J. Lyman Silsby, who was more of a Queen Anne style architect. But what he does do, and is characteristic of Wright's work, is to emphasize the geometry of the architecture. You can see the gable is a very, very prominent, strong, overemphasized triangle. And within that, we do see that band of windows I talked about, clustering, smaller windows into a wide band that gives a long, wide vista of the exterior. Even this little half-round window over top is heavily geometric. And then, of course, the bays, the entry and the window bay on the ground floor, are strong polygonal shapes, and even the brick porch that extends out has a sort of circular form to it. So the thing that Wright does throughout his entire career, and we see it starting right here in 1889 with his own house and his first real commission, is this emphasis on geometry, even if it isn't quite the low-slung Prairie-style building yet. This is one of the later additions he put on, I think around 1905 or so, and this is the playroom in the back. This is literally room for his children. He had 6 children with Kitty here in Oak Park, and when you were inside, hopefully they talked about how it was designed for children, that as an adult, your eye level is up around here at the base of the arch and not at the window level. But if you squat down, and I don't know if you did this, but next time you take a tour here and you go in, squat down like you're a little child, like you're only 3 or 4 feet tall, and you look straight out the windows. It's perfectly scaled for a child, even though it has this soaring vaulted ceiling, which is definitely, this vaulted ceiling is straight out of the influence he had from Louis Sullivan. And notice the filigree of the skylight woodwork here, which, by the way, is machine made. The art glass windows were generally machine made. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of those. He believed in the principles of the arts and crafts movement, but he was willing to push that off to the side in order to create the architecture that he wanted. And it was easier for him often to make architecture that was machine made, and he didn't have a problem with that. He wanted the beauty of it and so forth, but he wasn't as strongly adhered to this philosophy of everything had to be handcrafted, even though he still did struggle with making his architecture affordable. Here is the view of the studio. So in 1898, he moves his office out to Oak Park and builds the studio connected to the house. This is also not quite Prairie style. It's still just a little bit, a few years before the full Prairie style will blossom. But we again see the very strong geometries in his architecture here, with the polygonal shaped studio on the left, and especially his library on the right, and even the strong rectangular geometries of the entry bay. And this is a great example of what he called his passage of discovery. There isn't a staircase and entry leading straight up from the street into the entry hall here. You have to go around here to the side, you meander to a stair here, you turn again, go up onto an outer platform, then you can go into the vestibule, and even then the doors are hidden off to the right and left. You have to turn, 6 or 7 times 90 degrees in order just to go in the front door of the studio. And doing so allows you to be looking around. Just the practicality, trying to find where the front door is. You're looking at the architecture, and you're experiencing some of the ornamentation that Richard Bach, a great sculptor, puts at the entry there, the stork columns. Here's a closer up view of that. Again, you see the wall is sort of blocking you off from the sidewalk. You have to go off a narrow staircase to the side and then turn a couple times. And you can see the stork columns a little better there on the left. Here's the floor plan of the studio out of the Wasmuth portfolio. So there's an entrance hall here in the center. He called it his library on the right. This really was his private office for the most part. And then the studio itself was here on the left. And this is where his employees in Wright created the Prairie style of architecture starting around 1900. Here's a view of the studio. Those strong geometries are very apparent. The balcony was used by various artists like Richard Bach. They could work up and use the mezzanine as some of their studio space while the draftspeople were working down below. And a view of the fireplace. Wright believed in having a fireplace in every space. And the story is he would have a roaring fire going even in the hot summer July afternoon. The workers had to suffer through that. So one of his first true Prairie style houses is the Ward Willits house. This is in Highland Park from 1902, one of the North Shore suburbs. It isn't quite the first Prairie style house considered by scholars, but it's one of the most prominent, very early ones. And you can see the principles and characteristics of the Prairie style pretty clearly here. We see how low slung or low pitched the roof can be. It's a hipped roof, so it slopes on all 4 sides. That eliminates the very vertical, prominent front gable like what we saw with his own house. We see it spreads out over the landscape. It's not a simple rectangle. It moves out in various directions. We see here the second floor, which is actually one of the primary living spaces, is a band of windows and another band of windows just below that. And the horizontality is emphasized with these bands of trim and these wide garden walls that stretch out into the landscape. He really wanted to break down the barriers between the inside and the outside nature. And he does that with the bands of art glass windows and with these wide open terraces with garden walls that stretched out into the landscape. Here's another view of it. You get a good view of the art glass windows and how they're banded together. They may be individual windows, but instead of just being put punched into a wider wall area, they become the wall itself. And it's almost like the curtain wall philosophy of the Chicago School high-rise that we talked about last time. Here is the floor plans of it and a view from the Wasmuth portfolio. And you can see right at the center, if you look right here on the left plan, the ground floor, This is the fireplace. This is the central mass of the house, the hearth. And sometimes there would be several fireplaces in the different rooms that are spread, spiraled around it. Sometimes the scholars call this a pinwheel plan because it's almost like that center point, and it pinwheels, spirals around that center point of the fireplace or hearth. Another early masterpiece of his Prairie style is the Susan Dana House in Springfield, Illinois, one of the only good things about Springfield, frankly, 1902. This is a little bit of a mix. You can see there is a gable on the front entrance here. So it isn't a full hipped roof that he would generally employ in the Prairie style, but it's a very low pitch, very deep eaves, and it doesn't have that strong vertical mass that a typical gable end would have. He has this arched entryway. This is derived directly from Louis Sullivan, who would often use that archway in his buildings, and Wright had worked for Sullivan for many years and was heavily influenced by Sullivan's design philosophy. And Sullivan himself got this sort of Roman arch concept from H.H. Richardson and the work he did in Chicago. Along the base here, we see the garden wall out front, and we see another band of windows that stretch out and really allow the house to open up to the exterior around it. Ironically, many of Wright's Prairie-style houses are built in fairly urban, tight suburban communities, and so they're not sitting out on the wide open prairie. So it's a bit ironic that he wanted this huge connection to nature and then the views outside, and typically the view you got was of your neighbor's house across the street or next door, but the concept at least was there. Here we see the entrance really well, and the beautiful plaster, molded plaster ornamentation up in the eaves. That allows a horizontal break and really helps reduce the vertical mass of the house as well. Everything should be emphasizing the horizontality. He does introduce a little bit of verticality with these piers, which a little more of that Sullivan vertical high-rise concept breaking in here, but it's really still contrasted. It's almost like just a little bit of contrast to the overall horizontality that the house has. Here's a view from the back courtyard area. So this would be a more private space, and he can really open the window walls here to the private garden area. And you can see, you know, how one can really do a band of windows. But like I say, it becomes just a curtain wall of glass, similar to the philosophy of the Chicago School architects. This is the one of the main living rooms, and again you see that barrel vault like we saw in his playroom that he would try out first in the playroom. He liked it. He puts it here with one of his paying clients, Susan Dana. Interesting, a lot of Wright's early clients were women who really subscribed to the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement and kind of a progressive lifestyle. And you know, even if it was a family, it was often the woman of the household, the wife, that was sort of pushing for Wright to be hired and to sort of overseeing, working directly with Wright to create this home. And you know, their husband paid for it or something, but might not have been very involved in the design. And I don't mean to be dismissive of that. That was really important because it showed the importance of the role, emerging role that women had in taking control and charge of this more progressive views about life and how people should live. Here's a more view of the woodwork and the art glass windows that he creates here. This is the entrance hall. Just to the left is you can see a little bit of the arched entry. And again, you don't just come in the door and walk up a flight of stairs into the main living space. You have to turn a couple of times and meander until you get into this grand entrance hall, which is somewhat evocative of the grand entrance hall that we first saw in Red House. And again, Wright would often do this. There isn't just a little vestibule and then rooms. He connects all of these spaces really in into one giant living hall almost. This is the dining room, which is a fantastic space. It's barrel vaulted too. You can't see it in this photograph, but you see the incredible art glass light fixtures. There's stenciling and murals on the wall, the art glass windows. If you get a chance, if you haven't, and you go to Springfield, you visit the Capitol, you visit the Lincoln sites, don't miss the Dana House. This is a house museum that has almost all of its original furniture. It is well worth the entrance fee. Here's a historic view of the dining room, and there you can see the barrel vaulted ceiling there. Detailed view of the art glass windows. Another great example that we would have talked about on our walking tour, if we were able to do our walking tour, is the Arthur Heurtley house right on Forest Avenue from 1902. I'll skip through these a little bit, but here he's using brick masonry, but notice how he emphasizes the horizontality even of the brick masonry. He uses different colored bands of brick, and the mortar joints. He colors the horizontal mortar joints, the typical sort of whitish color, but the vertical joints he had colored to match the color of the brick, and they disappear when you're set back from a distance. So all you see are horizontal lines. You see another arched entry, you see the garden walls that stretch out, the low slung hip roof, the band of windows. The living space here is actually on what we would call the second floor. And he wanted to raise people up off the ground and give them a better vista from their living room and dining room than you might typically have. This is a great view of the entrance. Again, the entry is not a straight shot right up from the sidewalk. You can actually go along the side of the property and then turn a few times to get to that arched entryway. Here's a view of the living room, another arched fireplace that emphasizes the hearth that's also influenced by Louis Sullivan. Unity Temple, of course, is one of the great masterpieces here, right here in Oak Park from 1906, finished 1908. Here's a Wasmuth portfolio print of it. I'm going to be talking about, I've mentioned Wasmuth a couple times. I'll explain what Wasmuth is and what its significance is in a couple of lectures. So just keep that term in mind. It's a German name, actually, so I'll come back to that a little later. Here's the view of it since it's been restored really beautifully in the last few years. Let me do another poll here real quick. Oops. See, did that poll pop up or not? I think it, there we go. So just popped up the poll. Have you been to Unity Temple? You may have to click down at the bottom. There's the poll. Okay, most of you have. A couple of you have not. Here's another site that you really should go to. You can take a tour when the world is back open again. You can take a tour, but even better is to go to a performance. They often have musical or artistic performances there, and the acoustics at Unity Temple are fantastic. And a restoration has just been finished just a few years ago by my former boss, Gunny Harbo, and did a fantastic job, both of the concrete exterior and the interior finishes and colors as well, and really brought it back. What's really significant about Unity Temple is that it was in reinforced concrete. This is one of the first major reinforced concrete buildings in America. It's not the first, and Wright didn't invent concrete construction and so forth, but he was one of the first ones to take this new technology and say, hey, I'm going to work with this. And this also shows that break that Wright had with the sort of medieval, handcraftedness versus, modern technologies. Wright embraced this modern technology of concrete, which actually dates back to the Roman era, but certainly wasn't something used in medieval construction at all, and fully embraced it. He wasn't very masterful at it, and it had a lot of structural problems that had to be fixed in the restoration, but you give them a lot of credit for adapting this early on. And the exterior is sort of walled off, and that's because he wanted, when you got into the inner sanctuary, he wanted you to be within this sanctuary and closed off from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. And the windows are only up at the top, sort of like a clear story type windows, and that really helps you focus on the spirituality of the service on the inside. But these deep overhanging cantilevered eaves, those are evocative of the Prairie School, even though this isn't a Prairie School house, that some of those same characteristics do show up here at Unity Temple. And of course, the famous columns with the very geometric patterns and designs on them, see there. Here's the floor plan. It's really two wings connected by a grand entrance hall. There's that grand entrance hall again right here in the center. The main sanctuary is this square on the left. And even to get into the sanctuary, for those who've been there, you know that you sort of go down and around almost in the basement, and then you climb up into the main space. And that is symbolic. The idea of that, say if the philosophy of humans being sinners, and you're down in the ground and you rise up towards the heavens into this sanctuary space. And then when the service is over, then you can emerge directly out back into the main vestibule, into the Unity Hall, which is on the right side there. Here's a section of it. Again, we can see the walls closing you in and just the windows at the top and a beautiful skylight at the center to let light in, but to otherwise really enclose you in this sanctuary space. The view of the altar from here. This is a photo I took recently. So this is the restored finishes, plaster finishes, and the woodwork inside. The colors are so muted. He often picked autumnal colors in his architecture because that was his favorite time of year, I guess. But he loved the colors, the browns and tans and deep reds that come in autumn. Here's a view of the skylight. Another view of the skylight and some of the light fixtures within. The Gale house, I'll just mention briefly, from 1909. This is going to be a very important house for modernist architects, and I'll probably come back to this. Again, we would have seen this on our walking tours, so I'm going to skip over this briefly here. But you can see the cantilevered balconies that stick out here and the cantilevered eaves. There's almost a similarity more to Unity Temple here than there is to some of the Prairie style houses we were seeing. And his most famous masterpiece is probably Robie House from 1909. This is in south side of Chicago, down in Hyde Park. This is a historic view of it. And again, this is one of the ironic houses that it sets in a very dense urban neighborhood, not in the wide open prairie. Even at the time, it was still a fairly dense urban neighborhood. And this is also brick, again, emphasizing everything about this emphasizes the horizontal lines. Floor plan, we see a central mass right here on the ground floor or the main level plan with the fireplace up here, and the dining room and living room up here on the top revolve around that. So that's part of that core chimney mass, and you can see that very clearly in this view of the living room with bands of windows on both sides just flooding the room with light and with vistas out to the landscape, in this case the cityscape around it. Here's a view of the dining room. The Robie House has also been undergoing a lot of restoration, also by Gunny Harbo mostly in the last few years. Here's a historic view of the living room, or dining room, excuse me. Beautiful woodwork. Okay, I'm going to stop here for today, and we'll briefly talk about the arts and crafts movement in California, especially in relation to the brothers Charles and Henry Greene, when we pick up next time.